Are
They're
we
all
gonna do
interesting
like an
topics,
intro?
that's for sure.
You got like an intro?
Yeah, we'll
I
talk
like the
about
Hoy
our
4 hours.
yeah, our Roy 4 hours.
I
Well,
don't.
it's not going to be
I,
much of a debate if we get into Hoy 4 hours, guys. I'm sitting pretty at
yeah.
1800.
Well, I could just argue and say I have squat hours, and
Um,
that equates to plus
I
four
have
hours.
I have 3 years of military experience. That gives me a ton of
That does,
political
yeah.
experience, right?
Ah,
It
that does.
does.
I have
Um,
2,078 hours.
Holy crap!
Jesus Christ.
Oh yeah.
Um, so I'm thinking anyone that wants to, I guess we're gonna do Ukraine aid for this time around. Um, and anyone who wants to actively, participate, everyone's more than welcome. Um, we're gonna start with just take 3 to 5 minutes to kind of give your take on the issue and lay out a little bit of your reasoning, and then we'll go around the room until everyone's given their little 5 minute spiel. And once everyone's done so, then we can kind of move towards whatever our points of disagreement were and just let it go organically from there. Everyone good with that?
hmm
That Sounds sounds pretty great. good.
All right, who wants to go first? Khan?
All right. Um, I think aid to Ukraine is a net positive, both for the sake of letting Ukraine decide their own fate, but also geopolitically putting the U.S. in a stronger position. Um, if anything, just in general, both for Europe and the Asia Pacific. Um, and I feel that too much attention is just put on the basic dollar value, and that not enough is paid attention to actually what's in the bill and how that's being divided. So all people see is like, oh, $100 billion for Ukraine. Why aren't we spending that on um, healthcare or the homeless or the refugee crisis, or why aren't we spending it on left, right, and center? But the makeup of the bill itself isn't something. Yeah, money. I think the money's better spent sending to Ukraine, in that if Ukraine wasn't happening, that money wouldn't be spent on the things that we want it to be spent on with healthcare and social programs. It would just end up in some other expensive government thing for the other party to rail at. That a lot of the opposition um, to Ukrainian aid, especially from the right in the U.S., has been from just we can't let Biden have a win in the year prior to the election. So those are my thoughts on aid for the moment.
All right. Anyone else want to go? All right. So I'm in the camp that we should cut aid to Ukraine pretty much entirely, or at least start that process. And the reason why, I'm not gonna wade into like the moral side of it, of at least not here right now. The moral part of whether Ukraine should be allowed to do whatever it wants, or Russia should be allowed to get away with whatever it wants. Um, but just in terms of the strategic interests of the US, I think it's in our interest to quit funding. And I'm not making the argument that we should quit funding because we could spend that money better stateside. I think that the money that we're spending in Ukraine is weakening us, or worsening our position geopolitically. Um, and the assumptions that are going into that are, I think pretty much everyone at this point agrees that the war is going to end in a negotiated settlement. There's not going to be like a decisive, you know, Russia's not going to be able to roll over Kiev in their next offensive or whatever, and Ukraine's not going to be able to, blitzkrieg their way to Crimea anytime soon. So more likely than not, it's going to be solved at the negotiating table. So what Ukraine and Russia are fighting over is their position of strength or weakness at the negotiating table. So that's the first assumption. My second assumption, and this is where a lot of the meat and potatoes are, I think that Ukraine's situation on the battlefield is going to get worse with time. We can get into the meat and potatoes of that later, but it basically boils down to the fact that we can't solve their manpower problem. And in the short term, at least, we can't match Russian artillery production. And the things that we can do, which is, provide boutique weapons and capabilities like F-16s and more HIMARS ammunition, stuff like that. That's all well and good, and it's embarrassing for Russia to, suffer deep strikes and, lose logistics hubs and stuff like that, but that doesn't translate into retaken territory. The second thing that I'm assuming here, which is another big point of probably disagreement with at least the conventional wisdom, is that what's at stake here is I don't think that the stakes are as high geopolitically as people make them out to be. I don't think that Russia has any intention of, starting wars with the Baltics or with the Scandinavian countries. I don't think that they even have interest in occupying all of Ukraine. I don't think that, the domino theory idea of, well, if we let one autocratic ruler get away with this here, that means that they're all going to start trying it left and right, and that, Xi is going to invade Taiwan the next day. I don't think that that's the case. And that transitions me to the last important point, which is that I think that China is the much, much, much bigger threat geopolitically for the US. And I think that in that coming struggle competition between the US and China, I think that the ship has sailed on Russia being on our side for that. But at the very least, we should do everything that we can to make sure that Russia and China are not cooperating. And I think that what we do when we double down on this war in Ukraine is we're kind of forcing Russia to cooperate with China. We're forcing them into each other's arms, which, like I said, if China's our greatest threat, we want to do everything that we can to weaken them. So a lot of this is, it's not really as much of a solution, and as much as it is kind of a criticism of what the policy has been, and a lot of the damage that I think we've done is probably irreparable for the near term. But I think that, at the end of the day, we should at least start marching into the direction of shutting this conflict down and husbanding our resources towards the bigger fight, which is going to be with China. So I'm sure that there's plenty of points of disagreement. So
Yeah.
what do you guys think?
I like both. I think both topics or both of y'all's aspect on things are pretty sound. The way I'm hearing it. I was going to add, if you think about it, if all these weapons, that we supplied to Ukraine, all these material and supply and logistics and all this that got supplied to Ukraine. What's interesting is, the aspect that there's a boundary to the war. and using those as weapons. And it's interesting to think about, if, what would be the implications if we used HIMARS on Russia? If they went into the Russian territory, you got to think of the cost politically in foreign affairs, and think a little bit about, you're going to have civilian casualties. There's a possibility for that. How would that change the world stage? That's also something that particularly is of interest, per se, in regards to, you know, aid for Ukraine, and how we're gauging, the laws of war, the boundaries of war, what you can and cannot do, how we're kind of barring them, per se, to wage war. And I thought that was pretty interesting. I know, and that you might have brought that up, Big Iron, or you might even Yukon. I may have missed that, but I find that pretty interesting. But yeah, both your arguments are pretty sound. I'm gonna stop talking and go eat for a minute. And let you guys delve that out some more if
Yeah,
you'd like to.
I'm glad you brought that up though, because that's this whole thing about or the question of whether or not we're going to allow. Well, it seems like the decision has already been made at this point, but we were debating earlier whether we should be allowing Ukraine to strike targets on Russian soil. And I was arguing that it was a bad idea because it's not going to gain much for Ukraine in the long run, but it's going to cost us a lot politically in the long run, in the sense that like I said in my kind of opening thing, I think that the strategically correct thing to do is shut this war down as soon as possible, and get back to normalizing relations with Russia so that they are not in China's camp. And, doing something like allowing Ukrainians, to use American weapons to strike within Russia. Russians are going to remember that for a long time. And it's just going to make it even more difficult, and even more, frankly, at this point, I don't even know if it's possible to drive a wedge between China and Russia. So I think it's kind of a short-sighted policy.
Right. Honestly, I think Ukraine's just kind of got their back against the wall. They really don't. I really don't see a way out for them right now in regards to their situation. And like you said, on the world stage, China's, looking like it's a pretty gnarly threat. And we want to make sure that the folks in the Pacific are taken care of for our allies and whatnot. And I'd agree with that. But also, like like you said as well, funding and all that. If you cut that, you can per se, you can't just, we have welfare, we have all that, we have all our systems in place in the U.S. that we use funding for. You know, it yeah, I can see that there's a way that this funding can potentially weaken us militarily, in our spending and our ability to wage war. I guess as we as we do are known for doing. So it's just interesting to think about that. And I'll stop talking for a minute. Sorry.
I think both sides are as well, like, have very good points in regards to that. I wholeheartedly agree that China, I think, is the bigger threat, but I'm not sure if I completely agree that I do think that yes, getting Russia closer to China is definitely a bad thing and we should strive away from that. But at the same time, it's kind of like I relate it to the whole domino theory that they said in Vietnam, where you don't want to let Vietnam follow communism because the rest of Southeast Asia will. And we look back on that and we're like, well, that wasn't correct, but it also wasn't wrong, because after Vietnam, then it was Cambodia and a little bit of Laos. But at the same time, so I think it could go both ways there. I also, from what I understand, and I don't know the direct sources from this, but I've always been of the opinion that I support aid to Ukraine just because the U.S., the stuff for the most part that we're sending over there, we're still replacing it with our own spending. It's not like we're giving them all of our stockpiles and then not producing more supplies after that. If anything, we're getting newer supplies. At least as far as I understand. I could be wrong there. But
I
that
think
was
you
kind of
are
my
right.
stance on
And
that.
you are right on that. And I'd actually say that the most recent bill that was passed, more than half of that money won't leave the US. Like,
Yeah,
I
they're basically just ordering, like, I think
yeah,
it was 30 billion of that 60 billion was basically ordering the next set of, or the next batch of shells and other equipment, excuse me, to replace what they were taking off the shelves to send into Ukraine.
put a chart in Geopolitics that breaks down appropriations, but like the largest category is US military procurement. It's stuff the
Yeah.
US branches are buying. It's not even going to Ukraine in any sort of capacity. Yes, it's replacing stuff we've sent them, especially artillery shells for 155s and stuff like that. The 14 billion is giving Ukraine a credit card and saying, here, you can buy from Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and from Texas Instruments and any other US defense contractor, and you can buy new production stuff from them.
What do they need calculators for?
I love my
Texas,
TI-84.
I love my TI-84. I have like 6 TI-84s because I keep losing them.
Texas Instruments makes the targeting systems for Javelin.
Yeah, which is wild.
Yeah, there's a very funny video on that where someone did Friends on the Other Side, but he showed all the companies that make defense products that also make like normal civilian products.
Yeah. There's like a kind of a running joke with like mechanical engineers where it's like, yep, you get out of school and where do you want to go work? The place that's gonna pay you something that you can't live on, or the place that makes bombs? It's
My
like
moral
all
compass
of us are
leaving
in the
my
defense industry.
my moral compass leaving my body when Lockheed Martin offers me a job.
Yeah, exactly. When you see the zeros.
But
Well, anyways,
yeah, but anyway, I I think that us helping Ukraine helps us against China more than it hurts us. In the same way that us supplying weapons to the Allies in World War II helped us more before World War One or World War II, because the US defense industry right now is extremely backlogged with orders for weapons, and not for Ukraine, but for all of our various allies. Everybody, especially Poland, a lot of countries have ordered stuff from US defense contractors, F-35s, HIMARS, uh, everything, because everyone in Europe is really scared that Russia's going to try something. Whether they will or not, it doesn't matter. It's everyone in Europe thinks it's going to happen. They've realized that war in Europe is now a possibility. Before 20, at least 2014, but definitely after 2022, it was a question. Everyone, is Russia wanting to be our friend? Are they just being sneaky and subterfugal? But now there's no doubt. Everyone in Europe, that's why Sweden and Finland joined NATO. Everyone in Europe is scared that Russia might try something. So they're spending a lot on US production, and the US, just like the rest of Europe when the Cold War ended, reduced its production. Like, we don't make Stinger missiles anymore. We don't make Mark 48 torpedoes anymore. We reduced all that production because the Cold War was over. We didn't need the giant, massive military industrial complex that was the 80s. We were just fighting counterinsurgencies at that point, Kosovo and Yugoslavia, and then Afghanistan and Iraq. So the production could afford to drop massively from its height in the 1980s. But now that Russia is invading and China is modernizing, everyone in the defense industry is starting to ramp that production back up, and the US is trying to get that production back going for everything, for artillery, shells, for SHORAD, for rifles, ammunition. So spending on Ukraine creates a natural demand for U.S. products that that encourages the various contractors to produce weapons and increase their production, making us more prepared for if the Asia Pacific kicks off.
So I got two questions for you then. One, if that is the case, if that's already the case, and like, our defense industry now is being mobilized and we're getting back onto a war footing, then we've already gotten our benefit. Do we need to continue doing this? Because if the initial invasion and the subsequent, 3 years of fighting, if that got the defense base where we need it to be, then we can leave it where it is. The other question is, do you think that we would have mobilized, or I'm using the word mobilized, I don't really think that's a good word, but we would have ramped up production of, or ramped up military spending with the China threat alone? Because the thing is, I think that the China threat is pretty different from the Russia threat in terms of what types of weapons we need to produce. And I think that people started getting spooked about China all the way back in, like 2017, 2016. And I don't think that I don't know what the numbers are. I'm sure we could figure this out with a Google search, but I don't know if the American defense industrial base reaction to the war in Russia has really affected much our footing, or our wartime footing, in regard to China. Like, I don't know if we stepped up ship production
Well,
or
you're right. It's two different wars. Ukraine's fighting a land war. They don't have a navy, and their air force is. The air war in Ukraine is weird.
it's
But
very weird.
yeah, you're right. Asia Pacific is a lot different in terms of what it's gonna be primarily naval and air, a lot less land fighting, because, well, we can talk Asia Pacific War specifically at a different time. But so let's see. Your first question was whether. Sorry, got lost in the.
I forgot it too. The second question was, okay, so
The first was,
y-
do you think we still need to be spending if the pumps are already primed on U.S. defense industry?
right, exactly.
And I spending on you. I think the problem is that they're two different things. Us spending more on our own defense industry is just a cause it's an effect of us supporting Ukraine, not the cause of us supporting Ukraine. The cause is policymakers in Washington saying we're going to support you no matter what, period, and us doing everything to support them. Us not supporting them after we said that we are going to support them, it gets into the whole signaling and our commitments to other countries. If we're unwilling to spend, what is it, like 0.05% of our defense on Ukraine, then are we really willing to fight when it's our troops on the ground over Taiwan or Japan or the Philippines? So it's yeah, defense spending on our own military is just ancillary to us having to supply Ukraine.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right in that it would be like a pretty devastating, like, political defeat for pretty much the entire foreign policy crowd in Washington and the concept of NATO. I don't think that NATO would disappear, but
Well,
that would be a pretty bad black
yeah.
mark, a pretty bad failure, and people would definitely lose a lot of confidence in American supremacy. Like it
Well,
puts a political chink in our armor.
I'm not so much worried about NATO because there's a lot more structure and binding resolutions with NATO than there is with the Asia Pacific. Because we do have defensive pacts with Japan and with the Philippines and like Australia, New Zealand, but none of them are NATO members. It's all individual alliances. It's not joint alliances. So I'm not so much worried about signaling when it comes to NATO. All of that's still important. It's more signaling to those Asia Pacific countries.
Yeah.
And then what was the second question? I should really type these down as you're saying them so I can remember
Really should.
I think it was like the material, like the type of material is different in the Pacific than what we're sending to Ukraine.
Yeah.
I would also like to add to that. I think it's not just about. It might be different material, but I do think that simply sending Ukraine, a nation which before the war the U.S. wasn't very close to at all, had no really obligation to defend. Was kind of Ukraine was always kind of notorious for like political corruption a lot before recently, and just the U.S. going out and supporting someone like that versus somebody such as Taiwan, which the U.S. has guaranteed for years, I think that sends a stronger message that the U.S. is willing to give this much support to a country which we didn't really have much ties with before the war versus what we could give to someone like Taiwan, who we have previously said we were support a bunch of times.
Yeah. Here's something to think about, though. I mean, is with regard to how current events have affected our defense industry, I mean, that's like us getting our shit together in terms of what we produce and the status of our military. That's not necessarily contingent upon the war in Ukraine. Like, we don't need to fund a war in order to fund our own mobilization. We can just, vote to mobilize, which is kind of what we're already doing. And I think that the world is freaked out enough already by what's happened so far that we are taking defense and security very, very seriously. And I don't think, honestly, like, most of what we're talking about here, I think is kind of at the low political level. Like the masses are freaked out and care a lot about defense, but the people in government have always cared a lot about defense. And I think if you look at like defense spending, it hasn't like spiked. Like it's still pretty much where it was prior to the war in Ukraine. So it's definitely like a political issue. I mean, we being normal people are now taking time out of our day to talk about it. But I don't think that in terms of the actual like material situation, much has really changed. And I would, I don't, I mean, I really don't like the idea that we need a war going on in order to make smart policy decisions. Like that's
Yeah. Sorry. Can I ask a question
we
real quick?
shouldn't. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, well, hang on. Finish your point, and I'll jump into my next question. I'm sorry. Should have interrupted you there.
You're good. I don't have a point. I'm just saying I think it's gross that we should
It's
use people getting killed as a as an impetus to do what we should be doing anyways. Because defense in the Pacific matters regardless of whether or not there's a war in Ukraine, right? And anyone that's smart and informed, which I hope that everyone in DC is, should be able to make decisions about how they should spend their money with regard to the Pacific, regardless of what's going on in Ukraine.
All right. So here comes my question. You ready for it? Or here comes my statement first about
I'm ready,
what
but
you
I
last
gotta grab
said.
a beer. I'll be
Okay.
listening.
All right. So I have no faith in DC politics anymore. I have no faith in the folks, especially the folks that have have made a career out of politicking, and they could be certainly they could be good people, but honestly, I'm one of those people on the fence that are one of the people kind of on the sideline saying we need term limits in regards to those folks that make a career out of it. Need some definitely need some fresh faces in the park. I think, and many of you guys probably can agree to this that really we're stuck in the 1970s and 60s. I feel like, in kind of the Vietnam era politics still in regards to kind of you know the old folks and their politicking and their kind of what do you say? Their loss of touch right now in
Yeah.
regards to where we're at currently in foreign affairs and social economic affairs and in the states.
Yeah.
But the other thing I was going to say is how much is, I guess you could say, NATO as a whole, and or you can say, well, let's look at it this way and say, okay, we know that the U.S. is spending this amount of money on Ukraine to aid and supply Ukraine, wage war. Then how much in regards to other NATO allies such as France or Germany, or the UK, how much are they in pulling their weight to kind of, offshoot that amount of funding that goes to Ukraine? Are they pulling their weight? I guess per se. I'm pretty sure politicians have said, "Oh well, dude," especially maybe the Republican Party, "Oh well, they're not pulling their weight," or maybe it was I don't know who specifically said something about other countries not pulling their weight. But I just was
I
curious
think
about.
Trump kind of started that.
Yeah, I
Trump
think
did make the big
that's
point
what I
back
was
when
going to
he
say.
was
Yeah,
Trump made a
yeah,
big
that's
point back
probably.
when he was president that Europe wasn't spending enough on its defense, and it
Well,
has
there you
changed.
go.
Europe
Yeah,
They've
as a whole has gotten more serious about defending themselves since Ukraine.
since Ukraine and since the U.S. starting to get serious with China.
I will say though, I think it's still kind of shocking that a lot of countries in Europe still have not gotten the was it 10% of their
It's
GDP for
2%.
the
I think
2%.
it's 2%.
Yeah, 2%. I think it's like what Poland and like Norway and someone else are the only ones that actually
Poland?
have it.
The thing is though, I think, and this used to be something that like pissed me off, and I kind of used to be in the camp of like, oh, they should spend what they want to spend or what they should spend. But if you think about it from the US's perspective, 2% of Europe's GDP is not a ton, and what does get spent is not stuff that we can use. It's stuff that's just going to sit around in Europe and not do anything because it's all run by European countries which aren't us and don't have the same interests as us. But what we get from them not spending anything on their militaries is we pretty much get a foreign policy blank check. We can push them around and do whatever we want because they're entirely reliant upon us for security. They're basically, you know, they're client states to a certain degree.
They're
And I think that I haven't thought about this much, but I think that that's probably why the US was comfortable with that situation for so long. Um, I don't know if it's I mean, as a Frenchman, I have conflicted. I have a bit of a conflict
Do
of interest there.
Do you think the Russia-Ukrainian conflict should be just a European problem? Do you think we should just
For
bow
the
out
for
and just exclude? This is say, all right, you guys can handle it. We'll back off. We'll let our other NATO allies step up on the plate. I'm sure they already have. Like already supplied. I know Germany
The
supplied Legos.
the EU
Go ahead, Con. I'm sorry.
the EU as a whole is trying to step up and supply them. Especially, I think of all the European countries, Eastern Europe has done a lot more in the early war to help Ukraine because they're on the doorstep, and especially Poland has done a lot because a lot of those countries had large stockpiles of old Soviet equipment they still had, old tanks, BMPs, AKs, artillery rounds for Soviet ammunition, 152 millimeter shells. Um, they sent a lot of that to Ukraine in the first year of the war, and we're currently like that aid bill. A lot of the money in there is replacing stuff in European countries with US stuff, like getting Abrams for Poland to replace T-72s and T-64s, or not T-64s, they don't have T-64s, T-72s that they had given to Ukraine. Um,
Yay, NATO standardized.
they're also buying Korean K2s.
Yeah, that's wild. The other thing, I think the EU has been like obviously they're not a military entity, but they've been sending tons of money into Ukraine to do all the, pretty much funding the government.
Yeah, we do that too, but the US is in a better position to fund militarily because if you think that the US defense industry shrunk at the end of the Cold War, it was nothing compared to Europe, in which a lot of that just flat disappeared. Which I don't blame them. If they
Yeah.
want to spend on schools and education and stuff like that as opposed to military, good for them. It was the 1990s. I mean, why not?
Well, the Soviet Union's gone. What the hell do they need a military for?
Hmm.
Can
And
I ask? Go ahead.
yeah,
I'm
shoot.
going to ask a follow up. Okay, I'm going to ask a follow up question in regards to Ukrainian economics, in regards to funding the Ukrainian economy right now. I can imagine that, and I could be totally wrong here. I can imagine majority of their economy was on bread production or wheat production, right? On farming, on farming aspects. I know they were. I forget what crop it was. I guess whatever makes.
I think it's wheat
Uh,
and sunflower and soy.
okay, that
Do they
seems.
grow soy?
Yeah, it seems right. Seems right. So they were pretty big agriculturally, probably before the war. I wonder if the majority of their economics or their economy was farming industry, and then so in regards to their economy now, it's definitely not probably feasible now if they're solely focusing on, which I don't think they probably were, but I'm pretty sure I'm gonna say maybe farming was probably a major aspect of their economy. I wonder how, like you said, I wonder how much money is going into Ukraine to kind of fund that offshoot. Because regards to war right now, you know they're definitely not farming. I mean, they might be
They're
somewhere,
f-
but
they're farming wherever they can, which is pretty much
yeah,
anywhere far from the front line. I think they're I forget the numbers, but they're, from what I know, and Con, you probably know more than I do, but their economy's not uh I mean it's not doing good obviously, but they
Well,
are able to get a good amount of grain out through the Black Sea corridor and through other countries. Um
and I
but
wonder where it's
for
being
the big
imported too.
picture, mostly
We'll go on
Africa, I
that
think.
later.
it's
Most probably, yeah.
Africa, Asia. It's the breadbasket of Europe, and yeah, their economy's running a deficit. But I'd be surprised to find a country that can fight a war like this and not run a deficit in its economy.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that's what I was.
Most countries run a deficit in peacetime, let alone wartime. So
Yeah, the Ukrainian government is entirely dependent upon Western money to literally just run the government. They don't make enough money to run their country as it currently exists. So,
yeah, because of all the
and
war
that's
funding.
right, and that's not even getting into the actual war materiel. Just like to keep the people that, you know, manage the ledgers in, keep them to keep their jobs. Europe needs to send them billions of dollars, which isn't that much money in
No,
modern context, but it is still an important thing to realize that the Ukrainian economy is not capable of sustaining the country, certainly not capable of sustaining the war. And if the war, well, once the war ends, hopefully, it's going to be, they're going to need a Marshall Plan to unfuck the country.
more than likely.
Yeah. Better hope they have a good economics guy to figure that out, because that's going to be a
Yeah.
pain in the butt.
And I mean, to kind of get back to the original question, I mean, I avoided the moral side of things in what I was
Oh
saying
yeah,
at the beginning, but I do think that like the sooner that this war ends is probably the better for the average Ukrainian person, for the Ukrainian individual. Because if this keeps going on, then I mean, how many mobilization waves is it going to take
we could
for there to be a
we could
settlement?
definitely jump into the horrible moral implications of a prolonged war, and especially the stuff that they had to go through in Ukraine, and you everybody in war, it's awful for both sides, both Russian and Ukrainian, civilians and soldiers alike. We could go all day into that aspect, the human impact of war, but that's for another time and
I
stuff.
I think no, I think that's for this time as well. I mean, there's a massive.
You
I
want
mean,
to
we don't.
talk about the human aspect of war?
Well,
Well, I haven't experienced it. I'll
If
say that I haven't experienced war. But let
I
Angry can add something. Go for it.
well,
Go for
no,
it, Angry.
right? Like right now, Ukraine is their minimum age for draftees that they're trying to get, isn't it like 28 years old or something right now, or maybe even older than that?
they
They're
dropped
doing
it
their
down, but yeah, they're keeping the
they're
kids
doing their
out.
best to keep the future of the country out of the war right now. But on the other hand, too, the amount of men and males that fled the country when the war started and still haven't returned, like it's shocking me that
I
like
think
their
it's like
country is at it's a
it's
huge
a few
percentage of
million.
their
I
yeah.
think it's like a couple million draft age men are not in the country. They managed to get
Yeah, and
out.
even still, that's not even the non-draft age, like the ones who are like 20 to 25, call it. Like, it's shocking to me that the amount of them that aren't willing to fight for their country, like their livelihood, their place, their home is at risk, but they chose to run from it, I guess. And
Well,
so part of me wonders like how much fighting spirit is there for their country to like keep on going through all of this,
Oh, that's
you
a
know?
good one. Yeah, morale is it's a good thing to think about. Yeah, go Big Iron.
I
Go
was
go.
gonna say
I know something's pulling in your head.
that's a complicated issue because
Mm-hmm.
the internal politics of Ukraine are, I mean, obviously, uh, really messy, especially prior to the war. I mean, it was a civil war for, you know, whatever, 8 years before Russia invaded. Um, there's, I think that it's a, I think that we should refrain from judging Ukrainians on their, like individual Ukrainians on the decisions that they make, because it's really hard to understand. I don't I can't imagine what it's like to live in a country like Ukraine, like in a post-Soviet country that also has this very complex history with Russia and has had so many problems over the past, since they've gained their independence. I just like it's a topic that's loaded enough for me to not be willing to cast any stones in any direction, because
That's fair.
I, I just don't get it.
Well, it's like a cultural difference, right? I mean, like growing up in the US, there is kind of that nationalism, for better or for worse, of everybody, kind of the we want to be independent, the freedom, we want to, we would fight for our country to be independent and for itself. And growing up in versus a post-Soviet occupied population that just might have not had that same kind of nationalism growing up, I think is really hard to kind of gauge the differences between that.
I think it's a lot more complicated than that too, because there's also just like, I mean, people don't like to talk about this anymore, not since the war started, but like, there's a lot of like, what defines the difference between a Russian and a Ukrainian is a loaded subject that I don't think any of us are able to talk about with much confidence.
Well,
But
just like all the other Soviet republics, right? They just imported so many ethnic Russians into Ukraine, just like all the other socialist republics, and
Yeah,
kind of to integrate the
that's
population to be
that's
more
true.
Russian.
Well, that had been done before
that
the
goes back
Soviet
to
Union.
like Ivan the Terrible back
Yeah.
in the
Yeah, true.
so
Well, but
Russification is a common thing all the way back to his age.
Russification has been a thing, but there's also
I
it's
get the point you're going for. It's like trying to find the difference between like an American or an Englishman like after the Revolutionary War. Like they all came or trying to define those differences. Or that's
well,
probably a bad example, but just
I
there's a
think that's a
close tie
decent
there.
example. I think that's a decent example. I mean, Shu, remember that thing we were in, um, where the dude was making his speech in Boston, and like the point of his speech was like, the king is denying us our rights as Englishmen.
Yeah, the Boston Tea Party reenactment we went to.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we went
yeah.
to, and basically this guy is just waxing poetic for like 20 minutes about how the King George is denying the Bostonians their rights as Englishmen, right?
Yeah.
We think about we think about the Bostonians at that time as Americans now, but they didn't think about themselves as Americans back then. They thought of themselves as Englishmen. And it's that type of thing where it's very easy to draw lines and change history to match your current national project. And I think that that's kind of what's going on in Ukraine and in Russia as well, where people are engaging in all sorts of historical revisionism on both sides in order to justify or in order to further their own political uh, agendas in the current day. And that's part of that is just how you do, like that's statecraft. But to kind of bring it back to the ground here, I mean, the Donbass is Russian. No one wants to admit this since 2022, but the Donbass is Russian and has kind of always been Russian. I say Russian. What does that mean? Well, Russian speaking people live there and have pretty much always lived there. what does that mean? Well, it wasn't a problem for Ukraine prior to 2014. They were perfectly happy to coexist with ethnic Russians, right? So something happened around 2014 that made ethnic Russians and ethnic Ukrainians not want to play nice anymore with each other in Ukraine. And that type of ethnic problem, like as Americans, we just have, like, Americans have a very difficult time understanding something like that because we have just no cultural frame of reference for it, at least excluding maybe our relationship with the English. But like I was saying with that anecdote with the things you and I went to, I mean, that's pretty much, we don't realize that anymore. Like we don't think about the American Revolution as an English affair. We think of it as an American affair, but they considered themselves English. It's funny, like the when the Western Roman Empire fell, the Byzantines were left. The the Byzantine Empire, they didn't consider themselves Byzantine. That was like something that historians came up with later. They called themselves Romans. I mean, that's like where the name Romania comes from.
I mean, it
Okay,
makes
so
sense.
I was going to say something about Zelensky and his rise to power. When did he come to power as president of Ukraine? And then what
So
party was he representing?
I just wasn't he. I don't know exactly the political stuff, but wasn't he a actor on a TV show that
he,
portrayed him as the president? Isn't that a
yes,
thing?
I actually watched the first episode because I was curious. Um, but yeah, he was a comedian and actor, and he played, I believe it's called Servant of the People, where a history teacher like he goes on a rant about how corrupt his leaders are and about how terrible they are, and like it's
Oh, this is
in the same
interesting. Keep
in the
going.
same
Keep
in
going.
the same way as like an American today would be like, oh, our leaders are so terrible and corrupt, and one of his students recorded his rant and then put his name on the ballot for president, and so he gets voted in as president of Ukraine just out of the blue all of a sudden. And yeah, that the show is him as president of Ukraine, and that got him popular enough to where he ran and became president of Ukraine in real life. And I think his election was
Interesting.
2018 or 2019, I think,
Very
is when
interesting.
he got elected.
Very intriguing. That's
That's awesome.
that's kind of ironic, you're TV show actor and you do your thing and you become president in the show and in real life. Pretty impressive.
What do they
I think
say?
his
Dress like the role you want or whatever.
And become it in real life. Just portray someone. Just become the character. That's what you're saying. Become the character.
Yeah,
Become it in
whatever.
real
Yeah,
life.
become the person you
Yeah,
want to be or whatever. I don't remember
yeah,
the saying.
Dress for the job
yeah.
you want.
Yeah, that one.
Now, now his political party. That's what interests me because all this. You
I
know,
think he was a political outsider.
Yeah,
so he was
I don't think any of us know enough about Ukrainian political parties to.
that's okay.
I definitely don't.
I was gonna swing saying what was the rise of nationalism in Ukraine, and maybe that was a potential aspect of
Predates
Ukrainian
It's
Zelensky.
yeah, it's the
nationalism, how that impacts the Ukrainian Russia war,
if if
how folks got upset spaghetti at Russians ethnic
I
groups.
I don't think that if I remember correctly, I think that Zelensky kind of ran on a platform of like reconciling with Russia and shutting down the war.
yeah,
Um,
trying to get a peace deal of the fighting that was going on in the east. And
I think he that I think anti-corruption and reconciliation were like his two big issues. He is. I forget what it. I don't remember if he's ethnically Russian or I know he speaks Russian.
Well, most of Ukraine speaks Russia for the same reason that a lot of former Soviet states speak Russian.
Yeah.
I mean, until recently, wasn't Ukrainian a dying language? And yeah, at least as far as I'm aware.
They were trying to encourage it, which is part of the reason why you had all the issues in Donbass.
Yeah, they were renaming a lot of cities and stuff.
It's not that they were forcing Russian out. It's kind of like how, well, Ireland, for instance, has laws on using Irish, and they teach Irish, but almost no one speaks it. But it's not a problem like it was in Ukraine, where people felt like the language was dying out, and then politicians used that as a political shtick that they could, jack the people with. Like, hey, this politician wants to get rid of Russian, or he doesn't like ethnic Russians. And that helped fuel a lot of the anger prior to 2014.
Yep.
I have a question for discussion. What do you guys think about the deal that Ukraine made to Russia about giving over their nukes back when they became a separate nation in exchange for Russia agreeing not to attack them? Like, I think it was basically ever. And how that kind of fell through.
They didn't have much of a choice.
Was
I think we're
Putin
both on the same page there. That no, Putin wasn't in power yet. It was Yeltsin.
okay?
Honestly, Ukraine didn't have much of a choice, and that's not like, well, I guess they were kind of forcing them. They weren't going to get aid money from the US unless they gave up their nukes, the US non-nuclear proliferation. So they didn't want Ukraine having its own weapons. And on top of that, it would have been extremely expensive for Ukraine to keep the weapons and try to get them operational again, because they didn't have all of the all of the launch officers and all of the technicians were all Russian. They were all from Moscow and all went back to Moscow whenever the Soviet Union fell. So they didn't have the
You see, I thought it was the other way around. I thought Ukraine was the the powerhouse of Russia in the sense of all the factories, all the knowledge and everything. I thought all of that was centered in Ukraine.
No. I mean the actual personnel, the people responsible for
Okay.
handling the nuclear weapons went back to Russia. They didn't have the launch codes, they didn't have the expertise, they didn't have the and just the funding to maintain the weapons in the first place. So it was like we could spend all this money while we're broke, post-Soviet country, to try and get some of these weapons back online, and now we have a nuclear option while everyone hates us because nuclear non-proliferation was very in vogue in the 90s. And not get aid money from the US, or we can give all these nukes back, get security guarantees from the Russians and the US, and I believe the UK were all signatories as well. It wasn't just Russia who was signatory to that. And then,
yeah, the US and the UK. I'm looking at it now. It's the Budapest Memorandum.
yes.
On security assurances.
And yeah, so they didn't have a choice economically, international politically. So it wouldn't have made, well, it would have made a difference today if they still had them, but at the time, with their thinking, it made more sense to give it back.
Sounded like kind of a no-brainer for the time, honestly.
I think this
hindsight's 2020.
Yeah, and it was I think Kazakhstan was also in that.
Yes.
The Budapest Memorandum, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, because they both had missile fields.
Belarus as well.
Well, it's kind of reversed because Belarus is hosting Russian weapons now.
Yeah.
I was going to say this flows on to our next topic, the textbooks and tactical nukes, deterrence.
Textbooks, tactical nuclear weapons.
Countering aggression, then and now. I think we should jump into that. I think that'd be fun. I think that'd be fun to talk a little bit about.
Oh
What do
man,
you,
that's a
what do you
big one
say?
though.
Nuclear theory.
I
That could
think
be a
we
whole
should.
episode, though.
That
I think
is,
we
yeah.
should dive just minutely into the topic. Just a little bit. Just a
I'll dive
little dibble dabble.
Okay, just
All
I'll
while we're
right.
dive
though
minutely.
on
Go
that
ahead, Jim.
topic, I've one a little bit of an off-topic question. On the Hearts of Iron 4 world tension meter, what do you think we are right now?
75. Probably a little lower. 65. Like a 65, right?
20?
You get it. Like
I'd say
half, right?
20.
20 or
20?
30%. I mean,
25.
Yeah, you could.
I mean,
Yeah,
I
you
think
could
that's
argue.
fair.
20,
Yeah, I
25%.
could say.
You could have a
Yeah.
full-scale war between Japan and China and still not be above 20%. So on the Hearts
Right.
of Iron 4
Well,
world
that was
tension
because quote unquote the world didn't care about China and Japan at that point. We do now.
Okay.
I have
I
I have
want
a
to say.
question kind of in vain with that. Not a Hoi 4 player, but like,
scale.
do you guys
You should be.
do you guys think we'll ever actually reach the point of another, call it world war? Do you think it would ever break out into the NATO, US, and I don't know if there's a name for all the US alliances in the Pacific, but do you think it'll reach that point where
It's
I'll call it the Western
unofficially
countries
In our
versus
lifetimes?
yeah. Do you think it'll ever actually reach that point, or do you think where everyone's the threat of MAD and everything else is keeping it pretty isolated to like Ukraine and Russia right now, or maybe a
yeah,
skirmish in the Taiwan Strait?
that
I'm
gets into
not.
nuclear theory.
It does a little bit.
I think. Go ahead. Go ahead. I'll wait. I'll hold off.
Ah, go ahead, Duck.
I think that honestly, in regards to implications of World War III, I think people have a sense that the use of nuclear weapons by all means will be the end of everything. I think that if we were going to have any type of full scale war, it would be on a level where nuclear weapons would be the last marble in the jar, the last
But
the
do you
last
think it
thing
would
it,
actually happen though? Because honestly, I don't think we'll ever reach the point
I think
for maybe decades
human
at least.
human nature in itself will take over at that point. I think it is solely on the person at that table at that key that makes that decision, and he or she will have to make that decision, not a politician.
Hmm.
And
I think
and that's the way it'll be.
there's no risk or very little risk of that happening in Europe. China's what worries me. I don't know how you feel about it, Con.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
go ahead,
think,
Con.
and this
Sorry.
doubles back into the original point of aid for Ukraine. I think Russia has spent a lot of its potential in Ukraine. Not all of it yet, but it's spending its potential. It's prioritizing the short-term ability to wage war in Ukraine over its long-term strengthening itself. So
Yeah.
I think it's very, very unlikely, short of surprise nuclear war, that Russia's going to go after NATO anytime soon. And there's very few countries that they border in Europe that aren't a part of NATO. So war in
Yeah,
Europe is unlikely, but war in the Pacific, I think there's a 50-50 chance I'll see it in my lifetime.
I'd agree.
I hope I never do.
Yeah, you might. The thing
Yeah,
is with Europe though, you're talking about a land war, and it's much more difficult to start a land war because of I think the primary reason is just because of how unthinkable it is and what you have to do in order to start a land war. There's not going to be like a little border skirmish that gets out of hand. Like if for a land war in Europe to happen, one side has to decide that it's gonna go for it. It's gonna
we're
go
gonna
for
put
the
all our
whole
eggs in one
thing.
basket, the whole tamale. All right.
No one is going to cross a border without an arrow drawn to the capital. You know, like it's when you do that, you're signing up for that world war. Whereas naval and air engagements are much easier to get started.
It's because more so with naval, yeah. Air less so because, you're flying above the borders and international skies are what? There's an altitude for people's borders. I don't know if you knew that, but they're like a certain altitude above your country is technically international airspace,
Hmm.
but obviously certain countries don't care. Like you couldn't fly like a U-2 over the heart of China, for instance. Like they don't care if you're technically above international or you're in international airspace and you're above where anyone would care about you. They're
Were
not
those
gonna let you do
Chinese
that.
weather balloons in international airspace?
Well, I mean, we shot
When we
them down.
shot them the fuck down.
Yeah. I don't think they were in international airspace. I don't think that was
Bro,
that's
I
high
The,
enough.
just love
the whole world is American airspace.
I just love the reactions to those clips of it getting shot down, like everybody on the beach just having a party and cheering and everything. It's America.
But naval, yeah, because like the South Pacific borders are just a nightmare.
Yeah.
Because even not even China, but even countries that are normally cordial with each other, their borders are constantly overlapping as well.
There's a I'm gonna send a diagram into the chat. Or diagram. I don't know why I said diagram. A
A
map.
map.
It's pretty wild.
So the chance of something like that, where I saw someone did a simulation of this, where they had like a U.S. warship that was transiting near a Chinese island, and they like war gamed out that specific battle of how that would go down.
Yeah, and we lost
If
like
the
half our
Chinese,
carriers.
yeah, if the Chinese chose to sink that ship and then a carrier task force respond, and then China hits it with ballistic missiles. But it's much easier to see something like that where a naval exchange gets out of hand, where like, a Filipino warship or a Filipino Coast Guard ship like goes near what China considers their waters, and then Chinese warships go to confront them, and then the Filipino warships like, I'm in international waters, it's fine, and the Chinese are like, leave, and that can get out of hand.
Yeah. It's definitely the South China Sea worries me much more than Taiwan does over the near term. Just because of how I mean, right now things are fine and we have a pretty good like de-escalation system set up. I don't know, there's a word. I think there's a word for it, but I forget. Like means for the two navies to talk to each other, and like if something happens, be like, hey, whoa, what the fuck are you doing? Are you trying to shoot us? And they're like, what? No.
It's
Let's all chill. Let's all take a chill pill. They have a chill pill hotline. So right now, I'm not super worried. But in the future, if that chill pill hotline goes away, and if relations get worse, then that's not good.
Well, I mean, we learned from the Cuban Missile Crisis that you need a hotline, or else things like that can get out of hand. The Cuban Missile Crisis and the Checkpoint Charlie incident.
Mm-hmm. Although we do have a tripwire force in Taiwan now, right? That was like a couple months ago.
I'm not sure. I mean, the U.S. Navy's already out there constantly. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Well,
think what it was just SF has some boots on the ground. It's not like an actual like presence stationed there. I think they just had people training over there, visiting, whatever. I don't
but
think we have
that's
troops like stationed there.
but they're uniformed American personnel, right?
I think so. Again, I don't have details on it either. I just pretty sure I heard it was just SF
That's
just doing things.
because the thing is, there's like there's something called like a tripwire force, which is basically when you
Yeah,
put when you put the dudes there
You-
just to say like, hey, if you want to invade this place, you're gonna have to kill these guys,
that was
capture
me
them or
in
whatever.
Poland.
Well, that's
And
what
That was literally me in Poland.
yeah,
Yeah, the NATO brigades that are in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, the international brigades.
well, I think the better
They're
example is the force that we had in Berlin in the Cold War.
Yeah, those
We
guys were
yeah,
just
put
gonna.
they
like a
had
brigade in Berlin.
the
Those
Berlin
guys were
brigade.
just
Yeah,
there. Those
they were
guys were
there to
going to be
die.
first
Like
contact.
just
Yep, first
they were
contact.
literally there to die. Like
They're there to
they're
say hey, hey
You
Russians,
got
if you're
murdered.
gonna do this, we're fucking doing this.
Or
Because
all
if you
the
kill our
no,
divisions
not
people,
they
just
we're gonna
have in
fight.
Korea.
well, yeah, not just the same thing with Korea but the Latvia, Lithuania before Ukraine. The worry was that Russia would try to blitz Lithuania to get to Kaliningrad. So they
Yeah.
would race their forces across the country and set up a land bridge and then say, come and take it.
Interesting
But if
tidbit to
there's
that.
but if there's
Go
a
ahead, go ahead.
tripwire force there, then you'll be killing British and French and German and whoever else happens to be there during that rotation, American. So you will inevitably bring in all of NATO. It won't just be Latvian troops that you're killing.
Yeah.
At my place of work, I had an old vet. He was in Berlin, and what he told me, he was a chopper pilot, right? So, his deal was to basically go up, go fly around Berlin, go check the borderline, the wall, and all that. And he remembers like looking across East Germany. Of course, this is him telling me this. This is just hearsay. I'm telling it from his perspective. He said that he saw the Russian hit pilot MI or the MI whatever helicopter they were using at the time. Maybe the MI8. I'm not sure what helicopter it was. It might have been the MI8 or it might have been the Russian naval helicopter. I can't even think of the name of it
It was a
right
Russian
now.
helicopter.
Some Russian helicopter with missiles strapped on it. He had missiles too. He remembered. I think one day the guy was waving at him in the helicopter across the border, and the other chopper. It was great. I thought that was pretty interesting. I know, just totally random, but in regards to you know human nature, I'm just waving across, saying what's
Yeah.
up. How's it
I
going, boys?
will. That is something that I should probably come clean about. I mean, my general attitude towards war is like it's a big tragedy, man. Regardless of who is right or wrong, you're taking a bunch of dudes that in peacetime would have been happy to have a beer with one another at a bar and shoot the shit, and making them go through hell to kill each other. It's a big fucking tragedy. I'm a little
It is.
disturbed. I'm a little disturbed by how gung ho a lot of people, especially in high places, are about just sending people into the meat grinder.
It's the need for violence, man. Need
I
for
don't know.
violence, to kill, to murder. It's a sensation to murder and kill.
I,
Not entirely. Probably not all that. There's all other
I,
implications too. But
No,
I think the DC people don't even know what violence is. It's just something on a screen for them.
I will say this is kind of getting off into different topics, but that's why I think mandatory service of some form should be a thing. It doesn't have to be military, but like something to like when people are getting out of high school to broaden their horizons of like people and who they know and who they see, so that way they can have a larger frame of reference than just like if they grew up rich and then get into politics and are completely disconnected from reality.
Yeah, I agree.
So that way we don't have people who have a extremely closed-minded view in charge of the country.
Yeah, this follows into politics and why you should make a career out of it, and you should have term limits
Hmm.
because we have definitely are out of touch. Yeah,
Full
Something
let me
that
circle.
say that again. So, the circle, we've gone full circle, partial circle, half circle, whatever you want to call it. Go ahead. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
just a quick, well, I guess this is a little bit domestic politics, but something that worries me is that I think that a lot of strategic decision making these days, at least, is done based off of like the calculus of, all right, what's gonna make sure that I look good?
What's going to get me reelected?
What's gonna get
Kind
me
of thing.
reelected? Or even, not even like the politicians. The thing is with the foreign, I've been looking into this a lot over the past, I mean, since the war started in Ukraine, pretty much. But like the the politicians themselves don't do a lot of the real decision making in foreign policy. There's a whole bunch of foreign policy think tanks in Washington that go around advising, and these are like totally private entities. These aren't like elected officials or anything. They're not controlled by the government. But like ISW is a great example. Institute for the Study of War is a think tank that advises Congress on also and lobbies Congress on all sorts of stuff. And I think they're kind of in the driver's seat for foreign policy. That is to say, the network of think tanks.
How do they quantify situations? How do you quantify? Does that make sense? How does a
Well,
think tank quantify the severity of a situation in a foreign affair? How do you quantify
depends on what you want
danger?
your outcome to be. And a lot of the think tanks and that kind of foreign policy thing, well, I'll say up front, it's kind of unfair to say, oh, I'm mad that we have all these think tanks coming up with foreign policy, but kind of like expecting a politician to be an expert in biochemistry in during the coronavirus. Like, oh, I'm mad our politicians aren't more well versed in viral infections. Like, of course they're going to go to people who are more well, quote unquote, more well versed in foreign politics and geopolitical thinking
To advise a strategy to
than
combat
to
the
advise
said.
us on a
Yeah,
strategy. Because
right. I follow you on
but
that. Yeah.
but a lot of these think tanks appeared in the 1950s during the very early Cold War. And Big Iron, I don't know if you watched, it was like a 6 hour podcast, so I don't blame you if you didn't. 3 or 6 hour, the one I sent you on the Destroyer of Worlds.
I think I
But
started it. I don't think I got super far.
it's long.
It's
I
on
don't
my
blame you.
list.
I don't blame you. But he talked about that period of time and how it was a reaction to the physicists and the scientists who were like, okay, we have nuclear weapons now. These are a new class of like weapons technology that we need to treat much more differently than we've treated everything in the past. We have to absolve war. We have to stop fighting because we can't afford to use these weapons. If we do, we'll end the world. And these think tanks cropped up as sort of like the opposite of that. Not the opposite, but thinking humanity isn't capable of evolving to a point where we can not use these weapons. Someone's going to use them eventually. So it's better to craft systems that work with how our current world works as opposed to trying, instead of changing humanity, just change the systems of humanity um, to better fit nuclear weapons
Hmm.
as opposed to changing how humanity operates. And that's where you get the start of game theory and that kind of where all of those, the Rand Corporation and all of those come from, is that period of time.
I kind of have something with that, and this is also going back to something you kind of were saying earlier, Big Iron. And you're kind of I think you were saying you're appalled at how like easily people want to go to war and stuff. And Con was just saying how like it's how humanity is the constant like push for war and like violence. But like with that, I would say that it's human nature to always want to go to war, to always want to be fighting. And like through that, there's a ton of change that always comes from it, like I would almost say for the better, both technology and like,
Well,
I'll even say culture wise.
Reaper,
And
you gotta
so,
stop reading Nietzsche.
what,
You've been reading way too much Nietzsche.
no, there was
what's that? I don't even know what that
general
is.
Friedrich Nietzsche. He's a nihilist, but
Uh,
no,
No, he's
there was
not.
a
Hang on a minute.
German.
Angry's not done yet.
no,
Sorry.
go ahead, Con. I
Okay.
need to regather my thought.
No, there was a German general who said that what was his quote? That war brings out both the greatest and worst qualities of humanity.
Hmm.
The
That's
cruelty of
on. I'm pretty sure that's on one of the Holy Four loading screens.
that
Yeah, I'm pretty.
Of
I'm
course
pretty
it
sure.
is. Of course it is.
Yeah, would be on there.
it brings out the most terrible, cruel, cunning, or terrible genius to develop weapons, but simultaneously it brings out courage, of duty, honor. So you have
Yeah,
both
but
ends, but
you
it's
can go ahead.
but it's not that humanity. Well, there are probably people who are more inclined to choose war and choose violence. But at what point does that become your only option to stop someone from doing something?
Here's the thing. Before we even get into that question, I think that there's a marked difference between people that are inclined towards violence and spiritualize violence in the way that you're describing, Reaper, where you see violence and conflict as a crucible and
Hmm.
something to be relished in and something to push towards, like constant. Like that's a philosophical set of beliefs that a lot of
Yeah,
people have. I don't think that the politicians making these decisions are in that camp.
I could
Like
agree with that.
these are not violent people. They're the I mean,
I would say that they're
they're old and
self-serving.
frail.
They're
Yeah,
Yeah,
people
I would
they're
say they're
old and
just
self-serving.
self-serving and they're willing to throw people away for their own gain.
people with
They're just
autodestructive tendencies.
sociopaths. They're just sociopaths. They don't, or at least they're really good at compartmentalizing. They or
Well,
they're sheltered from the reality of their policies. They're
Hmm.
not in touch with like the type of people that are making important decisions, whether they're in the think tank world or whether they're on the congressional side or whatever. They have no idea what trench warfare looks like. I mean, their interaction with war is every once in a while, someone from ISW will come in and show them a map or show them a graph or something. They don't know what it looks like. They don't know what it is. They're not violent people. They're not like going to fight clubs. They're like the definition of, you know, uh, I'm letting my morality poke through. They're not fighting
okay.
people, is my point. And
Yeah.
I I get your human nature argument that like people want to drift towards conflict, and I think you're right. Like I think that a lot of people really are looking for conflict with Russia in
Oh, always. Yeah.
particular.
Who do you think should make that call? Who should make a call to go to war? If not the politician,
Whoa.
if not the think tank,
This is the
who
philosophy.
Duck,
makes
that's
the
a huge freaking question.
who makes the call to start it? You know?
Who
Well,
makes the calls to start a war?
Yeah.
well,
I argue
legislatively,
no man could ever in of itself,
It should never
you
fall to
know,
one
but
person
it
ever.
never should fall
Well,
to one
sometimes
person.
it has to.
But
It's
then
Yeah.
just how it
Big
pans
Iron says
out.
it has to, but is your call, we're biased. We're a biased people. Human nature is bias. We're biased. To say that, my call to start a war is just and fair and holy, or
Mhm.
my call for war is terrible and unjust. Who is to judge?
That's
You
exactly
know,
where I was getting into earlier, though, about like how do you even determine who is actually right with it? Like, obviously, you can argue it with the who has the more unjust reasoning, who's wanting just to kill a certain type of people, or but like what if your reasoning is to make life better for your own people? You
I
know?
think it kind of does. So we're getting into.
you could argue. Go ahead, Big Iron. Actually, I don't know. Hang on. You could argue that it's an evolutionary necessity that war is a thing. That war in of itself is
It's a
an
tribal base.
evolutionary.
It's
It's an
you have something I want
evolutionary,
to make my
which
tribe
which
better.
is built via evolution,
You guys would
via
have
human
gotten along
behavior,
great with this whole group of people
which
back in
which
the
is
19th and early 20th centuries that were doing this little thing called social Darwinism.
which in of itself, yes, social Darwinism. That war in of itself is necessary for life on Earth.
It's a taboo idea now, so people don't give it the time of day.
Yeah, it
yeah,
is. Yeah,
That's
go ahead.
what I'll say. That's
yeah.
all I'm
Orson
gonna say.
Welles wrote a whole book on it called War of the Worlds.
Yep. The gentleman that wrote the socioeconomic book about what is it? He's telltale sign of socioeconomics. He wrote a book on the survival of masses, and how resources and things like war and implications of that impact populations within society, and it really fits well with natural biology of systems, which war is a thing that kills a said organism. Whoever whoever has the most whoever has the specific trait that can get you through that, get you onto the get your genes onto the next gene pool, or get you further down, the gene pool line.
Can I
But
give a
it's pretty
5-minute
interesting.
rant?
Sure.
I'm sure. Go for it.
So
Why not?
this is like um I suggested international relations theory as a potential topic because you can spend forever on it. But this is I think what we're talking about right now is really the intersection between uh, international relations theory and political philosophy. Because a lot of what you guys are talking about here is straight Thomas Hobbes.
Right.
And there are international relations theories. There are a whole bunch of different ones, but one of the really big ones is called realism, particularly structural realism, which is pretty much just Thomas Hobbes applied to international politics. Thomas Hobbes was basically saying that like people always think about like the whole like Locke and Hobbes type thing. Like I imagine that everyone that went to like American public school probably heard that kicking around at some point. And they usually frame it as like, well, Locke, you know, Locke thought that people were nice and cooperative and could, cooperate in a society, and therefore that we should establish democracy and have rights and stuff like that. And Thomas Hobbes was a pessimist asshole, and he thought that that wouldn't work. That was the version of it that I got when I was in public school, and high school and middle school. And what is a more elaborate way of putting it is that Thomas Hobbes looked at the human condition in its like pre-societal form. Hobbes was basically trying to ask the question, why do we have a state? Why do we need a state? Like, why do we need a government? And he looks at human beings without a government, which he experienced firsthand in the English Civil War. He looked around and he saw, okay, I see three things. One is scarcity. There's not enough shit to go around. There's a finite amount of every single resource, right? Whether it's food, whether it's water, whether it's housing, whether it's guns and
Yep.
security.
I follow
There's
you. I follow you.
there's finite amount of shit, scarcity.
Yep.
Two, we have subjectivity. Human beings are all individual subjects. Like, there's a scarce amount of hamburgers in the world, and if you have a hamburger, it benefits you, but it doesn't benefit me because of subjectivity, right?
Yeah.
So you're going to want that hamburger, and I'm going to want that hamburger. And the third thing he called, what did he call it? I think he called it like offensive equality or something like that. But basically, what he was saying was that all human beings have some degree of power. They can all hurt each other. Like, we can strangle each other, we can fight. We have some offensive capacity, and we're pretty equal in that regard. So,
I disagree with that.
well,
He didn't know about the aspect of evolution either. It's
well,
1500s. If that's
he
his
was
theory.
he was saying that human beings are in a state of competition because,
Yeah,
like, I
that
know,
that
because
makes
basically
sense.
I know that there's not enough stuff for both of us. I know that you're not going to be okay with me having stuff and you not having stuff, and I know that you can hurt me. Those are the three things for Thomas Hobbes.
Right.
And he's saying that the reason that we have a state is to put daddy, like, you have a big state, a big Leviathan is what he called it,
Right.
that's going to act as an arbiter between those things and say, like, hey, if you try to act violently, I'm going to fucking kill you. And that goes for both of you. So just stay in your lane and follow the rules. And that's how you form a society. You need to have something that acts as a monopoly on violence that can keep people in line, pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
That's Hobbes. And the international relations theory of structural realism basically takes that whole system and applies it to states. So you've got scarcity. There's not enough resources to go around for every single state.
Yeah.
You've got
It broadens the
subjectivity.
spectrum.
States,
Yeah.
obviously, what's good for China isn't good for the US. And offensive equality. We can all hurt each other and go to war. But the thing is that there's no state. There's no like, we can form societies as individuals because we can form states, but there's no international state. There's
Okay.
no night watchman for the state, or there's no night watchman for the world. So we're basically the international system is one of anarchy.
Yeah, I follow you.
So this gets back to conflict. Why does conflict happen? It's
Yeah.
because we are living in an anarchic system
So my
where
understanding of it is, with regard to anarchism, it's a war for resources. I feel like, it's a war for. It's beyond.
resources.
It's beyond. Like I feel like it would be
The thing
right.
is, though, it's not
I mean,
just resources, because the thing
I
is
know
that,
you listed. You listed. Well, I know resources was one of the things. I'm trying to recall the other two.
well, the thing
The
is,
ability to deal out violence. Right.
right,
Go
so
ahead.
like, well, okay, let's say that, like, you've got your little kingdom, and there's another little kingdom next to that kingdom, and there's like a coal mine right between you. Let's say that your kingdom A, and kingdom B decides that they want to go into this coal mine and start mining coal. And
Yeah.
you might not necessarily need more coal, but you do have to think about what's the other kingdom gonna be able to do if they get more
Yeah.
coal.
It's a war for
Are
resources.
they
So
it's
it's human nature to take everything, to be
well,
greedy.
the thing is, though, it's not just about taking the stuff. It's like, if there was no kingdom, like, if you're kingdom A, and let's say that there was no kingdom B, then you wouldn't give a shit about the coal. But if kingdom B is right there on your doorstep and they're taking that coal, then now you have to worry, oh shit, do I have a bully next to me? Like, what are their intentions? Are they just trying to get this coal so that they can, have nice warm fires in their place?
Right.
Or
So
are
you're
they trying
saying
to, like, build a
we
factory
don't
to make a
under
bunch of guns?
yeah, we don't understand the intention of that said resource, right? So, like, oh no, I see.
That's
Does that
subjectivity.
right?
That's Thomas Hobbes's second point, is subjectivity. You can't
Okay.
know.
Sorry. Yeah, I follow you. I follow you clearly now. Sorry. Follow
Yeah,
you.
I didn't elaborate on that one very well, but subjectivity. We don't know what the other subjects are trying to do.
Right.
So when they become more powerful, even if it's not explicitly economically more powerful, explicitly militarily more powerful, even if they're not acting threatening towards us, it's really freaky to have a big, powerful neighbor that could fuck you up anytime that it wanted and you couldn't do anything about it. So, what do if you're in a position where you have a powerful neighbor and you don't want to get fucked up? Well, you're going to try to
Yeah,
going to try to
you
build up your
either
own
find
power.
you find a way to kill them or you ally, I guess.
Yeah, so you're going to try to, I mean, historically speaking, most of the time they try to find a way to kill them. They try to increase their
Yeah.
own power.
Right. And then that either goes one of the way or the other.
And this is an entire theory of how the world works. And it's one theory of many. It's the one that I subscribe to, but there are other, legitimate theories that people have.
Well, you know what they say about theories? They're never really true. They're
No, they're
always
not.
they can always be proven false. But it's I mean, it's one of the many theories, right? It's a
Yeah,
reasonable theory.
my favorite international relations theorist is a guy named John Mearsheimer. He's like this dude from Brooklyn, got a really thick Brooklyn accent, but he always says, like, oh, a good theory is right about 60 to 70% of the time. If you can get 60 to 70%, you're doing great.
That's his gauge. That's his gauge for whether a theory is all right. It's like a
Yeah.
60-70. Oh God.
Well, the thing is, I mean, theories,
Well,
it's really tough, man. I mean, the world's really complicated, and you can
yeah,
only
that
fit
it
a
is.
theory into a
The
book.
world is
So,
the world is complicated.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, if you have this, if you subscribe to this theory of realism, um, the 2008 proclamation in Bucharest that we were going to include Ukraine into NATO was a really bad idea. Because you're basically telling the Russians, hey, the US is gonna become much more powerful next to you, or in contrast to you.
Yeah.
And naturally Russia freaked out. But that's not how people looked at it, or at least that's not how the people in charge looked at it at the time. They didn't pay attention to the balance of power.
All right.
So that's my rant.
No, that was good.
I'm gonna stop talking for
Well,
a
so
good
I
amount
don't
of time.
know how many more topics we have that people still want to hit, or we can maybe just go into like one last one here. I wanted to kind of just to circle back around, full circle back to Ukraine. How long do you guys think the conflict is going to last from this point on? How much longer?
I think it'll go until I think Russia will go until they are incapable of going anymore. I think they have plenty of more millions of bodies that they are willing to throw into it. And I think they'll go until all of their equipment stockpiles are burned up. I don't think there's a point where they'll accept defeat unless like Putin has a heart attack tomorrow or something. Like
I agree.
I don't think they're willing to stop until they've achieved what they wanted.
I agree up until your last point. I think if Putin had a heart attack, whoever replaced him would be equally committed.
You
I
think
think
so?
it depends
Yeah.
how stable Russia is, which right now it's pretty stable in terms of the control they have. But I think there always is the small likelihood that when you have somebody who's kind of rolled the way Putin does, that people finally do see their opportunity to finally
I
get
think
some
they could
liberties.
fracture.
Yeah. But I think it's an exponentially smaller chance.
The thing is, though, most of Putin's opposition is coming from the, I guess I'm going to call it the right, from the pro-war party, from people like Prigozhin that were saying, you're not executing the war well enough. I want victory. I don't want,
But
you're
that's
not
the thing,
delivering
though.
victory fast
The
enough.
dissent in Russia from the other side of that spectrum isn't going to be vocal because they're going to get put in jail. So it's kind of, I think, hard to gauge how many people actually feel that way because they're not going to openly express their dissatisfaction at the way things are going.
I think.
Well, to be fair, though, Prigozhin, just quick one, Prigozhin did openly express it, and he got killed too.
Yeah, but he did it in a way much louder than, like, I think the norm, you know? Like, everyone else in Russia, they, you get your, like, pundits on their debate shows that'll, say that they're not doing it well enough, but they won't, like, outright insult the Putin or the Russian Defense Ministry in a way that's, like, the way Prigozhin did.
Yeah.
I mean, he outright said, like, oh, you guys are traitors, like, we should turn our guns on you
Didn't
because
the
you're not doing it right.
didn't the Russian defense minister get ousted, or that last one, last
Yeah,
guy? Was it,
Shoigu's out.
Shoigu, he got reshuffled.
Yeah.
He's not. He's just in a different job now.
Okay. Well, that's just Russian politics.
They put an
It really is.
economist in charge.
Mm-hmm.
That's saying something, I guess.
Yeah.
I have no idea when the war will end.
I don't either. I think I know how it'll end, but I have no idea when.
I think we're both generally agreed it's going to be some sort of negotiated peace, but
It's
I
going to
think
be
Ukraine.
a frozen settlement or a frozen conflict, I think.
I think Ukraine will be willing to throw in the towel, like once their bodies start to run out.
well, I mean that's
Honestly.
both sides.
Right. Well, I agree entirely, which is why
That'll happen in Ukraine sooner, I think, though, is the point.
Yeah.
I would so much rather that the war ends because Ukraine ran out of equipment than that Ukraine ran out of bodies. Right?
Yeah, a body aspect of sheer casualty aspect will be decimating to a country.
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean,
So
Ukraine's future is already not good, and I just see the policy of continuing the war as just being worse for Ukraine and making its future so much worse. I mean, the sooner that this war can end and Ukraine can become safe, people will start coming back to Ukraine that are abroad. We can start rebuilding and funneling money towards getting their economy functioning again instead of, you know, creating, just more munitions and war material. I that's actually something that I haven't even drawn a or talked about yet, is like what's good for the US versus what's good for Ukraine. I mean,
I don't think we'll ever. Well, we'll probably will. Some tactician will figure it out or do an estimate. I wonder, in regards to casualties taken and for Ukrainian casualties, I wonder what number they're currently at in
Yeah.
regards to
Well,
their military loss and far as personnel numbers and stuff.
Ukraine has said how much they and Russia have lost. Russia said how much they have lost, and Ukraine's lost. The U.S. has made its estimates. Europe's made its estimates, and they're all different.
I'm curious,
Because
how long? Oh, sorry, Con, can you finish?
no, I was just saying because each has their own interest for one to be higher than the other.
Since we don't
I
know how
think
much longer the war is going to last, how long do you guys think NATO and the US is willing to continue to provide support? How many possible years down the line before the public just gets tired of it, or, you know,
I don't think the
do you
public
think
has
it
much to
dies
do with it,
after the
honestly.
election year?
Public
Do you think it
opinion
dies
isn't really going to affect it that much.
Yeah, I agree.
but to the point of like people are seeing these billions of dollars go away. Sure, they might
They're not.
not realize that. Hold on. Sure, they might not realize that that money is still staying in the U.S. economy. But at what point do they think that, hey, this politician isn't focusing on the country enough, and like it affects their reelectability? Kind of like how we were talking, politicians are just focusing on getting elected. You know,
That's extremely difficult to predict.
I'm just curious. What do you think? How many years
I think
down the
I,
line?
I think for a U.S. context, I think domestic issues are going to sway the elections more than foreign policy issues, unless the foreign policy issue becomes a domestic issue.
which is what the right is doing.
Yeah,
Which
Yeah,
because it
without
goes
with
Biden.
yeah,
Hmm.
we should probably try and stay clear of domestic politics.
Yeah, that's a different podcast.
Roger that. We'll hold that
It
off.
is.
Hold
It
domestic
is.
politics off.
Yeah, I think that though that's I think that's a good way of looking at it though. Is that we'll the foreign policy establishment will fund the war so long as they are domestically politically able to, and that latter question, how long are they domestically politically able to? That's a crapshoot. I mean, who knows?
Yeah.
Hmm.
By the way, welcome to the conversation, Metro.
But
You
Welcome.
missed.
You're only
You
2
missed
hours
it.
late. You missed a lot.
All right. Well,
I
if
mean,
we're cool with that, I think I'll move us back down. Do we want to decide on the next topic now so people can think about it for next time?
Kind of just jumped around
I
topics
think
today.
I
Kinda
think some
jumped around,
Israel.
yeah.
I think
Yeah,
some
but the center thing to like talk
What about-
about, and then you can bridge out from there.
Yeah.
What about the
'Cause
Middle East? The Middle East.
ooh, that
Wanna do
could
the
be a
Middle
good
East?
one. Talk about like
Uh,
Middle East, Israel.
That was one of the options. Was the
Mhm.
Thunderdome?
Yeah.
Thunderdome.
Middle East sounds pretty
Right.
awesome.
We can do the Middle East next.
All right, sounds good.